Well, the time is now 13 minutes to 2. Children's programmes begin at 4:20. But now we return to the pages of Ceefax and some music.
Hi, this is another episode of Byte High No Limits Teletext People series. I'm Carl Attrell, and today we're speaking to Graham Norwood. Graham Norwood is a prolific property writer in the UK, writing for such publications as Estate Agent Today and Letting Agent Today. But before all of this, he worked at Ceefax for the news section, and this is what we're talking about today. So I started by asking Graham how he got to work at Ceefax.
Right, well, I always wanted to be a journalist, right from, I think when I took the 11 Plus, which is now many, many years ago. I was asked what I wanted to be, and I said I wanted to be a journalist. And I did 3 years at university up the road from Cardiff in Swansea. But in my final year, I applied for the sort of much sought BBC News trainee scheme. And to be entirely honest, I was very sceptical, and I thought, as I hadn't gone to Oxbridge and I didn't have a private school education, I thought it most unlikely I'd succeed. But against all odds, and my own extraordinary surprise, I was taken on by the BBC as a news trainee, and it's an absolutely brilliant scheme. I think it's not very different today, some decades on. But what it does allow you to do is it allows you to spend a few days or a few weeks or a few months, actually, in different parts of the BBC. So the obvious ones that people wanted to go to were things like World Service, the TV newsroom, the main national radio newsroom, but also Ceefax was an opportunity. And I went to Ceefax, and it was only for about 2 weeks, and then you're whisked off as a trainee to do other things. But after about a year of the trainee scheme, you are encouraged, if you wish, to apply for a permanent job within the BBC. One came up at Ceefax, and I was very keen on the basis of the fortnight or so I'd spent there in my first year at the corporation. I was very keen to explore it further. And that's how I came both to be interested in teletext and to get a job there. And I was there for many years afterwards.
So when you went to Ceefax, what was your first job there?
The first job there was as a sub-editor. By that time, and we're talking about 1979, 1980 now, there was the hierarchy. It was a small office. I mean, there were only about 15 people in all, although that was much greater than it was just a few years before that. But out of that 15, there were a few researchers who, if you like, didn't have any editorial responsibilities directly. They did do research, or they looked at TV, or they worked out TV listings, or they did some information for anything from games to news features and so on. But I went in as the next rung up, which was as a sub-editor, and that was pretty much exclusively on the news side, which is what I wanted. There were three main areas of output on Ceefax which had sub-editors working for them, and those were news, finance, and sport. And the other parts of Ceefax, a very substantial number of pages, things like, fun and games, TV listings, cinema reviews, all sorts of things, they were done really by a mixture of the researchers and in the sort of spare time, so to speak, of the sub-editors. So I did do a spattering of everything as a sub-editor, but it was chiefly news.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. So did you? So what other things did you dabble in? Did you dabble in fun and games?
Well, I was very keen to get some film reviews there, because I was always, as a kid, fascinated by the cinema, and the prospect of living in London for the first time and having these opportunities to go to press showings of films, to be able to see a film on a Tuesday afternoon that didn't get out into the cinema until Friday was a strange thrill, I have to say. So I enjoyed doing that, and so we set up this section called "In the Two and Nines," and you sort of had to be of a certain age to make sense of that title. But back in the early 80s, that was, had a bit of a ring to it. But it was a weekly cinema section. We also had a few more slightly serious things. We had a sort of a face-to-face section, which I remember working on, which was, we had two people with, if you like, polar opposite views on a subject. It wasn't always a serious subject. In fact, normally it wasn't at all a serious subject. But we had people who would just submit, 400 or 500 words, and we'd tailor them a little bit to make them sensible within the confines of a Ceefax page. So we did that. And I had my time on Fun and Games, and we had to do some TV listings and the odd TV review. So it was a very eclectic, editorially, it was a very eclectic experience.
Did you find the style of writing for teletext was something you had to acquire quickly? Is a lot of people say to try and get the story in a page in 3 paragraphs and an explainer is a bit of a dark art. It
certainly is, and I have to say, I mean, you had to develop an extraordinary skill. I mean, it wasn't anything that we had to develop it. There was no choice, because you had to make a story make sense in a very short number of words. So clearly you simplified things. But I have to say, I've been a journalist for the last 40 years, the last 25 or more of which have been outside of Ceefax. And there's never been a story that I have written that I haven't subconsciously, if not consciously, been grateful to Ceefax for the ability to condense complex storylines and to write things concisely and to write them quickly. Because what really turned me on about Ceefax, the other news trainees all wanted to work they all wanted to be Kate Adie, or they all wanted to be, John Humphreys reading the news on TV or whatever. But what turned me on to Ceefax and why I wanted to get a job there was that it was so quick. It may have had a pretty small audience compared to TV or radio, but it was a fantastic way of bringing news to people faster than anything else at that time. And that was a real thrill for somebody who wanted to be a journalist, and part of that process is breaking news. That was such a thrilling aspect of the medium.
Yeah, and were you still using sort of rip and read to get your news in from the agencies on telexes and the like at that time?
Yes, we had about 6 wire machines, of which rip and read was, as others have said in this series, rip and read was, if you like, the BBC's internal news agency, which it ran primarily for local radio and for things like the Radio 1 and Radio 2 short bulletins that they have on the hour or half hour. And so that was a pretty good condensed way of doing a story. In fact, some of those stories were shorter than Ceefax stories, because they had to have maybe 6 or 8 stories in a 2-minute bulletin on a local radio station. So they were, very short indeed. Plus, we also had the Press Association, and we had Reuters, and we had usually, they did vary over time, but we had another foreign news agency called AFP, a French news agency, but that was in English, but it was a well-respected news agency. Plus, we had a couple of sports and finance feeds with dedicated information coming, obviously, about sport from one of them and from the stock exchange with the other. So it was in its time absolutely cutting edge. I think over the last decade and a half, we've all been used to extraordinary breaking news. On our phone, we get a ping and we suddenly realise what happened in the world a few moments earlier. But back in the 80s in particular, there was nothing quicker than teletext. And for all of its reputation, for all the blocky graphics and, slightly funny things it did and everything else, for me as a young journalist, I was sort of desperately keen to prove myself as a journalist. It was absolutely the number one thing to get involved with.
Working in that sort of time, were there any particular stories that you actually sort of that stick out in the mind from reporting?
Yeah, there were a lot. I mean, there were the ones that we all sort of, that the whole world prepared for. Things like Mandela being released, Thatcher resigning after a few days of things like that. So that was towards the end of the 80s and early 90s. I remember a particularly tragic one was the Challenger space aircraft, because one of the things we had within the BBC, and Ceefax had this as much as any other part of the BBC, is that we had several, a bank of TV screens showing live picture feeds, sometimes commentaries as well, from other broadcasters around the world. And those were the ones that were primarily for use in the TV newsroom, so they could select images that they would then use at the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news or whatever. But we had access to them as well. And I think by the time the Challenger disaster happened, people were quite blasé about space shots. But it was a real shock because it was about 5:30 in the afternoon, I recall, UK time. And we were looking at it going up and we all thought, well, there you are, it's all done and dusted, another space got gone up. And then it suddenly and tragically exploded. And so we very quickly did a news flash and a story. And I think on that, as on many others, we were the quickest BBC outlet because we had access to the information and we could immediately turn that, literally within seconds into something that went on air. So it was a in that case, a very tragic story, but it was a privilege to be able to be at the forefront of sort of immediate information then, the kind of immediate information that we take for granted now. But then it was a real, really wonderful thing to be involved in. And there were other things, there were, things like political, Anwar Sadat, who was a leader in Egypt. Again, the reason I remember this is not that I had a great fascination with Egyptian politics, but it was something where the pictures were coming into the Ceefax newsroom, and it seemed a rather mundane thing, a leader arriving at an airport and everything else, and then suddenly the poor man was shot. And again, you translated this immediacy into a very short but fantastic piece of breaking news.
Was there any times that your teletext service was syndicated out to any other news services around the world or anything like that? Do you know?
Syndicated is probably a slightly flattering term. It happened in 2 or 3 different ways. I think probably the most prolific way was actually through individuals. For example, I went and did a bit of work helping to set up a Hungarian teletext service. And I went to Singapore when they were setting up a teletext service there. And several others from Ceefax, because the BBC, or Britain really, was leading in teletext creation. Different ones from us. I think there were some from the ITV Oracle service, and then teletext went on to talk with others about it. And there were those. My own experience was Hungary, Singapore, and the great thrill was doing a Los Angeles teletext service that was set up for the 1980. I can't remember, was it 1984 or 1986? Right, I think it was 1984 Olympics. So a TV station that had a very loose relationship with the BBC, a TV station called KTTV in Los Angeles, may or may not still exist all these years on, but it wanted to do a teletext service to try to introduce teletext in the United States. It was very localized. It was only within Los Angeles and that sort of greater Los Angeles area. So it was only in California, but it was one of the first ones in America. And I know that, you've spoken with Mort Smith and others who did much, much more work in the United States than I did. But I did a few weeks during the Olympics in Los Angeles. And, you clearly felt that as a medium working, I think primarily working for the BBC, but I think working anywhere in Britain for a teletext service meant you were at the start of something that was very exciting. And the fact that we were requested by other broadcasters around the world to try to sort of lend our expertise was flattering and actually jolly nice to go to these conferences as well. So there was that part. And I think we also did have some of our news information was used by, for example, the Irish service, RTE, the state broadcaster in the Republic of Ireland, set up a service called Airtel. And I think they used some Ceefax news and sports pages and so on because they had a much smaller operation than we did. And there was an obvious sort of, physical proximity and similarity to the interest in stories. So they by prior arrangement, they did use some of our stories. So there was we knew we were lucky enough to be some of the first in the world to be doing this sort of thing, and it was a good experience to sort of spread that information around.
Oh, so when you mentioned the USA, would you have any theories as to why the world standard teletext didn't take off in the USA?
No, not really. I mean, I suspect there were too many contending. This is almost more from a philosophical point of view than an actual knowledge point of view, if you like. But I suspect there were too many contending commercial issues to try to stop the world standard taking off. And it's surfaced in a number of things. As I understand it, there were a number of areas of broadcasting where the United States, and because it was so large and so influential and so well funded and so many different private interests involved, it was difficult to get the level of unanimity, if you like, that existed in, for example, the European Broadcast Union, which was a surprisingly important body for the development of teletext in Europe. Well, maybe not surprising, but anyway, it was an important body for the development of teletext on this continent.
Yeah. So with your career at Ceefax, you must have seen a few changes in directions with new director generals taking over. Did the service sort of change during your tenure there?
Yes, I must say I left the BBC over 20 years ago, but I remain to this day a huge fan of the BBC and what it does in all aspects, really. And it was great for developing Ceefax, but, and there inevitably is a but here, the politics of an organisation as big as the BBC means sometimes that a service which could be very nimble and fleet of foot, like Ceefax, sometimes got bogged down a bit in politics. So, for example, I was at Ceefax for about 14 years, I think. I moved from sub-editor to chief sub-editor, and then to duty editor, and then for a few years to editor. And during those 14 years, Ceefax was looked after, if you like, by a department called Presentation, which was the department that looked after all the continuity announcements between programs. And also at that time, it looked after the weather. So it was this sort of odd ragbag of things, continuity announcements between shows, weather forecasts, and Ceefax were looked after. And we had a very charming and supportive chap leading that department and keen about Ceefax and everything else. But it wasn't sort of, if you like, at the centre of things. And so I think most people in Ceefax were delighted a few years later when there was a reorganisation all happening above our heads. We had no say in it at all. But when there was a reorganisation and Ceefax was taken over by the News and Current Affairs division, as it was then called, and it was that didn't turn it into a completely sort of, grey news-only service, but it was wrecking its potential probably a lot more. But the only problem then was that News and Current Affairs was an absolutely huge department with 2,000 or 3,000 people in it, and there was little old Ceefax, which by that time may have had about 25 or 30 people, but we were sometimes thought of as, we felt we were sometimes thought of as the poor relation, or the slightly underfunded, slightly forgotten thing, or they don't quite know what to do with us, or whatever. Now, I think part of that is because it was still a developing breed, and I think we were, everybody in the BBC was sort of thinking the absolute best way to move it forward. And I, because of my own sort of background and ambitions, I suppose, at the time and everything else, I was delighted that it went into news. But it did put it in a little bit more of a straitjacket, whereas Oracle and then eventually the teletext service on ITV could be very enterprising. Within BBC News, it was quite you had a stricter code professionally to work to, and on the one hand, that did develop Ceefax. We had link-ups with some news programs, which undoubtedly gave us a much higher profile than we would have had otherwise. But on the other hand, it perhaps stopped us developing sideways, if you like, to work with other streams of the BBC that might have happened if news hadn't taken us over.
Yes, so at that time, I think the Ceefax went to a service where it went, what was it, at speed on BBC One and in depth on BBC Two with the current affairs.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes, yeah. That's it. Yeah, and there were sort of one-off odd experiments. For example, the BBC breakfast programme, which I think was originally called Breakfast Time, BBC TV, which originally called Breakfast Time, and then I think it might have become Breakfast, and it might now be called Breakfast News. But anyway, it was Breakfast Time at the time, and it was getting revamped after a few years, and so they had this idea of having of the programme itself being a slightly harder news programme than it had been previously. It was no longer Frank Boff in a woolly jumper. It was going to be, a newsreader in a shirt and tie. And to complement that, there was going to be a sort of a rolling news flash provided by Ceefax, only viewable by teletext viewers, but constantly updated during the 2 or 3 hours of the programme. And so the programme would tell its viewers, the presenter would tell TV viewers that, we're now going over to have, 10 minutes about sport. During that time, if you want news, call up page 150 and it will cycle through some news flashes and so on. So that was it was an interesting idea. Actually, that specific idea I thought didn't work terribly well, but that's a sort of a symptom, or not a symptom, a symbol of how the BBC was trying to find a way to use this quite exciting medium to sort of endorse the BBC way of doing things, a very newsy way of doing it. And as I say, I think that, it's not giving away any great secrets, especially decades on. But there were some people in Ceefax who thought, this is a bit boring, isn't it? This is a bit newsy. And others thought, this is terrific. This is just what it needs. And this plays to the strength of the medium. So I fell in the latter category. But there were lots of people who were great people who were a bit less enthusiastic about it being as news-focused as it became.
Hi, I'm Layla Johnston from Shift, Run, Stop and Hack Circus, and you're listening to the Byte High No Limit podcast.
You've been working there for a while. Did you start to see the sun beginning to set on Ceefax? Was there any sort of like anything coming down the pipe that made you think that it was going to stop at some point?
Probably not, but I think that owes more to our short-sightedness than to anything else. I mean, by the time I do remember a call coming into the newsroom. I think I had become duty editor at that time. I'm trying to work out when that would have been, but sort of mid-late 80s. And there was a call came in, and maybe it was about 1990, but somebody had heard of this thing called the internet. There was something going on to do with this thing called the internet. And I remember a call coming in, and I can't remember which of the colleagues it was, but my colleague took the call. And there was some idea about putting. Some people advocated at the time, and because the internet at that point was entirely a technology-driven exercise of interest to and known about the technical person rather than the general person. And there was a feeling, surely Ceefax should go on to the internet and should be available via that means rather than via the vertical blanking interval and everything that seemed suddenly became a bit passé. And I remember that person saying, no, nobody's heard of that way of doing anything. Lots of people have heard of Ceefax because at that point there were, some millions of sets in the country that could receive Ceefax, Oracle, and teletext in general. And therefore, we sort of thought we were the norm. And I think I left before the internet sort of grabbed everybody by the balls, so to speak. But I think it was clear by that time we were going out. But I'll be quite honest, I don't think any of us thought it was going to happen as quickly or as comprehensively as it did. I think in retrospect, and there's nothing as great as retrospective rewriting of history. We all feel now we've sort of pioneered the internet, which may or may not be the case. But we certainly feel that what went on to become BBC Online in its early days was actually run by one or two people who were in the latter days of Ceefax. So there was a clear overlap. And it was only a few years ago that one or two people who worked at Ceefax when I was there, which now is sort of appears to be in the Middle Ages, really. But there were one or two people who were there who were still working at BBC Online until only a few years ago. So there was an obvious migration across. But I have to say, at the time I was there, it may have been short-sightedness on our part, but I think we thought we had reached a successful level with teletext without necessarily seeing it as shortly to be, shot out of the water by a much greater thing called the internet.
What was your fondest memories of teletexting or working at Ceefax?
Oh, fantastic! Well, it was my first sort of proper journalism. I'd done sort of, when I was a teenager and time at university and everything else, I'd done sort of summer jobs in local radio in the West Country where I'm from, and lots of things like that. But working at Ceefax was my first proper continuous journalistic job. So from that point of view, it is surrounded by, a fantastic warm glow, I have to say. It was a fantastic team. We knew we were at the start of something that was going to develop and appeared to be developing well. And we were lucky in the BBC, actually, because we didn't really have to worry about sort of financial insecurity for the service. Of course, ultimately, anything can get cut in the BBC, and we all know that happens all the time. But we knew it was developing, so we didn't really fear for our jobs at any point, which I know, lots of other parts of journalism have done all the time. So therefore, that allowed us a rather warmer glow, and it was great. It was great working with a mix of people, doing a mix of things. I particularly like the feeling that we gradually drew in people who were clearly early on, not necessarily starting, but early on in their journalistic careers. And I found it a great source of pride that Ceefax became something that people who wanted to be journalists and were journalists felt was a legitimate and perfectly respectable thing to do at the BBC. Because when I joined Ceefax, my peers as news trainees at the time, frankly, thought I was bonkers. They all wanted to do these sort of, higher level jobs. They wanted to work in Westminster, or they wanted to work in, the World at One, or they wanted to work at the 10 o'clock news. And they thought I was mad. And I was sort of, although there obviously were other journalists who had been at Ceefax before me, I suppose I was the first one to sort of come through the BBC machine as a journalist and choose Ceefax. And I was delighted in my sort of 14 years there that by the end of that time, it was absolutely routine that people who joined Ceefax had been journalists elsewhere in the BBC. And there are several. You've already spoken with Steve Rosenberg, but there were several others who remain, in fact, now BBC people who spent at least a while at Ceefax, and they contributed to Ceefax, and I hope Ceefax contributed to their journalistic skills, as we spoke about.
Yeah. Oh, it demonstrably did. Yeah, that's for sure. So, what do you get up to now, Graham? What did you move on to? Within the BBC, I moved on from Ceefax to something called News Gathering, which is it's a sort of an all-embracing part of the news department that really, I suppose, for want of a better term, could look after the correspondents and reporters. So when you see, Jeremy Bowen in Ukraine, this is now, clearly I'm talking about 20 odd years ago, but when you see him in Ukraine, or you see, a correspondent reporting on what's happening in France or wherever, or with Trump in the United States, they all work for this department called News Gathering. And so I got a sort of a junior managerial role there. But I have to say, it fast became clear to me that what I really wanted to be was a journalist and not a manager. And I suspect I was a great deal better at being a journalist than I was a manager. So the very late 90s, just before the millennium, I left the BBC to go freelance, and I'd already developed an interest in property. That was becoming quite a big thing in the media at that point. Just about all of the newspapers were beginning to have property supplements. TV programs like Location with Phil Spencer and all the other programs like that were beginning to appear on TV. So the whole property lifestyle subject was beginning to be quite popular. So I was quite interested in it, especially from the sort of property business, housing market side. So I
really lucked into that, really. So I left the BBC late in 1999, started doing freelancing, moved back to the southwest, which is where I'm from originally. And for the last 22 years or more now, I've been a freelance journalist. Currently, I write mostly for the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail about property and housing markets. But I also write 2 property industry online newsletters, one for landlords and one for letting agents. They are extraordinarily anarchish. You sort of got to have a peculiar interest in renting and things like that to be interested in those newsletters. But the other publications, the Times and the Mail, are consumer facing, as they say, and therefore general readers. It's quite interesting, actually, because the online newsletters I do, each day there are multiple stories, but they're quite short. And although they are longer than the old Ceefax stories, they still use the same, or they require me to use the same editorial discipline of turning something that could be quite complex and could be quite dry and boring, to be honest, into something much shorter and much more interesting, if possible. So, I've always banged the drum for the qualities of teletext writing, and I think I still use it to the day, to today, 40 odd years after I started at Ceefax.
So where do we find your property output? Can we find that anywhere online?
Oh, yep. There's plenty. If you are really short of things to do, and people should really reconsider their lifestyles if they are this short of things to do. But if you Google my name, you'll find a fair few things. If you look at something called Landlord Today online, you'll see a lot of my work, and the same something called Letting Agent Today. They're pretty specialist things, and I also contribute to another sister publication, and believe it or not, that's called Estate Agent Today. So there's a lot of me online. Hardly anything from the Ceefax days, I have to say, but that's because sadly we sort of just slightly missed both chronologically on that, but I have been fascinated in the last few years. There seems to have been a genuine, there's always a bit of nostalgia for everything in this country, and so that Ceefax has not escaped that, if you like, and there's a certain nostalgia for Ceefax and for the teletext medium. But also, I think there's a recognition now that it's got a little bit of a place in the history of how we get our information, whether that's football results or election results. And if it's not unreasonable, can I just ask, why have you sort of resuscitated the concept of teletext to talk to us old veterans of the medium?
Well, it's because personally, the stories need to be told, and then they need to be listened to, and then people can then take from that the experiences of people that works at it. It's just as fascinating to me, and hopefully to people in the future. As we would listen to an old recording of someone using a steam train or something like that, maybe, Graham. But the story has to be told, because if no one asks the questions, then the answers can't be put on tape, so to speak. So that's really what it is, and it's a lovely anthology of memories and stories that I'm getting. Yeah. They've been really enjoyable to gather. Yeah. And
I think we owe you a bit of a vote of thanks, we're now a rather disparate group of people dotted around the country at different ages and everything else. But I think we probably owe you a vote of thanks for doing it in such an enjoyable and fascinating way. Oh,
well, that's very kind of you to say. It's all I have to do is sit back and listen. I'm a bit of an agent provocateur, really, but it's just this is what the internet's for. It's for collecting experiences, you know. And it's always fascinated me with teletext, and I never thought I'd speak to the engine drivers on the other side of the TV screen.
One common theme is that we all look back on it quite fondly. Actually, I think, and with proper respect, because it was a proper thing to do, but also it was a fun thing to be in at the start of.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for thinking of me and tracking me down.
And a big thank you once again for Graham Norwood for appearing on this podcast. I hope you enjoy these podcasts as much as I do making them. If you want to support it in any way at all, you can always like or leave us a review on one of the podcast apps. You can also, if you feel inclined, leave a donation on my Ko-fi page, which is kofi.com/Byte High. Thanks again to Meat Lotion for being my first contributor to that. Anything like that just goes towards the general podcast hosting costs, and that's about it. Maybe a bit of publicity material as well, but no one's going to be buying a yacht on the money, so just hope you enjoy listening to all of these. Music is supplied by Mr. Nisness, as in business, and you can find him on Bandcamp at mrnisness at bandcamp.com. Teletext People is presented by me, Carl Attrell, and he's a Byte High No Limit production. So, until next time, keep it blocky.
You're still here? It's over. Go home.